For more than 40 years, he's brought to life the stories of America. Now, Ken Burns turns his lens to the struggle that created America. The American Revolution, coming fall 2025 on PBS and the PBS app.
Good morning, Boston. As an American history educator, I can't think of any better way to bring the 104th NCSS conference to a close than with our final guests. Moderating our conversation with Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein is Michael Hernandez. Michael is an award-winning educator, best-selling author, and international speaker known for his work in transforming education and engaging diverse audiences. With a focus on student-centered learning, Michael's work emphasizes digital and civic literacy, fostering global mindedness, and preparing students to be intellectually agile and emotionally resilient. His latest book, Storytelling with Purpose, Digital Projects to Ignite Student Curiosity, explores how to reignite student engagement by tapping into their passion and authenticity. Through his podcast and newsletter, Change the Narrative, Michael reaches a global audience, continuing his mission to reshape education for the future. Sarah Botstein has played a vital role in bringing some of the most acclaimed documentaries to PBS audiences. As a producer, her collaborations with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick include celebrated series like Jazz, The War, Prohibition, the Vietnam War, College Behind Bars, and Hemingway. In 2022, Botstein made her directorial debut with the U.S. and the Holocaust, a critically acclaimed series exploring America's response to one of history's greatest humanitarian crises. Beyond filmmaking, Botstein contributes to Ken Burns' Unum, a digital platform connecting historical themes across the Florentine Films category. She also partners with PBS Learning Media and WETA-TV to create educational resources for classrooms nationwide. She is currently directing an ambitious project on the American Revolution and the life of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, continuing her commitment to engaging audiences with history's most compelling stories. Ken Burns has been shaping how we view history for nearly 50 years through his groundbreaking documentary films. Since his Academy Award-nominated debut, Brooklyn Bridge, Burns has directed and produced some of the most acclaimed documentaries of our time, including the Civil War, baseball, the national parks, the Vietnam War, and his most recent work, The American Buffalo. His films don't just tell stories, they explore the deeper truths of America's past and its enduring impact on the present. Often hailed as one of the most influential filmmakers of our time, Ken Burns has redefined the documentary genre. Historian Stephen Ambrose noted, more Americans get their history from Ken Burns than any other source. While Wynton Marsalis praised him as a master of timing who captures the human spirit of every story. With 17 Emmys, 2 Grammys, 2 Oscar nominations, and a Television Academy Hall of Fame induction in 2022, Burns continues to inspire audiences. Upcoming projects include films on Leonardo da Vinci and the American Revolution, and they promise to enrich our understanding of history. And I don't need to welcome them to the stage because they're already up here. Thank you for joining us for a conversation about history.
Thank you, Jenny. That was really nice. Very kind of you. I'm really honored to be here with Sarah Botstein and Ken Burns, co-directors, along with David Schmidt, of the new documentary of the American Revolution, set for release in the fall of 2025. And as a filmmaker and high school teacher of journalism and cinema, I really couldn't be more thrilled to be on stage with these accomplished filmmakers.
Our pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
I'm really interested in not only hearing about your film, but also the role of history and civics in the classroom these days. And we know how challenging it is for a variety of reasons. And so you're really interested to hear what you have to say about how we can keep social studies relevant and engaging for our students. And on a personal note, I just want to say that Ken, you inspired me to take my own students to Vietnam and Cuba and Cambodia to produce documentaries, and got to witness firsthand the transformative power of experiential learning and storytelling to transform learning. And so thank you so much for that. So Ken, let's start off. So this is your next big film in your 40-year career. How did you come up with the idea for the project? When was that? And how long have you been working on the film?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Most people make it the kind of, not lazy, but sort of sloppy, why now? We go, now, we've been working on it for a decade or whatever it might be. I have to back up. You know, wars are human beings at their absolute worst, and the story of human beings is the story of wars, I'm sorry to say. One of our Marines in our Vietnam series says, it's the history of the world. And he's right. There's very few times when we're not doing it. But they also reveal other things, sometimes positive things, but they, in their totality, are kind of, you know, distilled essence of human behavior, good, bad, and otherwise, and are incredibly rewarding if you study them with a kind of clear eye, without the sentimentality, the barnacles of sentimentality that often encrust and make things a good war or become bloodless, gallant myth in the case of the Civil War. So I did the Civil War. We vowed we'd never do another film on a war again. It was really emotionally draining. The soldiers there said when they were in combat, North and South, that they'd seen the elephant, which I assume is the most exotic thing they could think of, because being in combat when your life is threatened at any moment, your violent death is possible at any moment, is paradoxically the most vivifying experience human beings have. That's why we have PTSD, because you sometimes cannot get off that bus. But we learned at the end of the 90s, including Sarah and I learned that there were something like a study, maybe you guys, an incredible number of graduating high school seniors, the argument of why we need history and social studies and civics, thought we fought with the Germans against the Russians in the Second World War, combined with a statistic I learned in '99 that there were more than 1,000 veterans of the Second World War dying each day. I'm telling you, that number is down to nothing. It's an actuarial fact. And so we decided, okay, we will do another war. Before the ink was dry on that, it was broadcast in 2007. It's called The War. In January of 2006, I said, we're doing Vietnam next. And 10.5 years later, in the fall of 2017, we did Vietnam. Before the ink was dry on Vietnam, in December of 2015, I said, we're doing the revolution. And so from that moment on, we haven't been in full-time production on it. Lots of other projects that have come and gone during the course of that time, but we have been focusing on probably, I mean, I said this about the Holocaust and it was misunderstood. I said I won't work on a more important film. It doesn't mean that other films like the Civil War or even jazz or other things aren't as important, but I can't imagine a more complicated project. Vietnam was that way, the Holocaust was like that, then doing the revolution. And a lot of it has to do with, there are no photographs or newsreels. And unless some of you have a photograph, or please see us afterwards. We can really use it. It requires new sort of strategies and new kind of calibrations to do that. But it's particularly critical right now that we have an origin story that's complex and true and involves all the stories. We accept the violence of the Civil War and all the other wars we've been involved in, but the revolution we keep like a bug in amber, sort of protected. It's just great men thinking great thoughts, and it is, and that's a huge part of this story, but it has much more dynamism, and that it doesn't have to become a pawn for any kind of war about interpretation of history. You can just tell a complete and complex story, which is what we have been laboring now for years and years and years. And today, I think, or yesterday, will be the conclusion of the series a year from now. The last episode will be on.
So you kind of talked about it already, but Sarah, this topic is almost 250 years old. How do we keep it relevant today, and what are you both hoping to achieve with the film?
Well, I think we were talking on our way over here. I think one of the things, a very lofty goal of ours, is to try to bring the country together to have a thoughtful, calm, nuanced, deep conversation about our founding struggle. We have this incredibly complicated, unlikely story of winning the revolution. It was unlikely that we were going to win. It's, as Ken just said, a war that I think we have done a better job of encrusting in great ideals, but not understanding the cost of 18th century war and what happened here. And its 250th birthday seems like a good reason to really understand it. Having said that, as Ken was also saying, our films take so long that at each stage of production, I think the film feels relevant for different and similar reasons, which is why history really matters. Whatever the present is, the subject that you're studying has resonances, and those resonances sometimes stay the same and they sometimes change. And so we're really excited to work with everybody in this room to figure out how to bring this war to families' dinner tables to talk about the things we've done well, the things we haven't done well, the reasons history matters, and how and why we should celebrate the American experiment.
It's amazing. So growing up in the U.S., we all are very familiar with this story, or so we think. And I think we have that painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, sort of.
Nobody stands up in a boat
We love that painting for that reason.
filled with ice in the middle of the night during a snowstorm.
Yeah. It's
with
great
a flag that didn't exist. So right then and there, you will see that painting once in our introduction as we talk about how unreal, as the historian Maya Jasanoff says, how unreal and detached we are from it. And that's the point that I was trying to make, that it is, as Sarah is saying, there is not a moment in history where there aren't human beings involved. And if there are human beings involved, then they're going to have relevance to us today, because human nature doesn't change. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, and he's absolutely right if he did, history doesn't repeat itself. It never has, but it rhymes. And our job is to tell a complete and complex history that tells all the stories, however inconvenient some of them may be. We have a sign in our editing room that says, it's complicated. And let me tell you, it is complicated. And there are filmmakers everywhere that when a scene is working, you don't want to change it. But we learn new information. We never stop researching. We never stop writing. And so we're constantly destabilizing our own work with new information. And that's a good thing. That we all ought to be open, not to, as many people fear, changing or not telling their story or cutting out. You're just pulling back the camera and saying, boy, there's lots more complex stories to tell. And that's been our mission, and it's no more true here because of the ways in which our understanding it is so superficial. You will not see that painting again, particularly when he's crossing the Delaware, on Christmas, of 77, there. So
we've heard the story so many times in so many different ways, accurately or not so accurately. What are you bringing to this topic and this project that's new and fresh?
Wow. Well, I think new and fresh. I think it's actually the cumulative effect of the film. It's the scholars that we have, the stories of people you probably haven't heard of, but also the stories of the people you have heard of, and trying to see them in a different, more complicated light, and to, like all of us, celebrate what we do well and try to understand what we don't do so well so that we maybe don't do that again, to learn from our mistakes. It's also extremely challenging, and I know we'll both talk about this this morning, to tell a story when there isn't a photographic record, and that many of the stories we want to tell are about people who are not portrayed even in a lithograph. So to try to bring people to life without documentary evidence of what they looked like and sounded like is an enormous challenge, but also, I think, particularly for all of you, a great challenge for students to think about what would a little girl have done? What would a young free black have done? What would this native nation did this and this native nation did that, and why did they make those choices, and what choices would you have made? And a lot of Americans just wanted to get out of the way, actually. They weren't so deeply involved, and that is familiar to us today. So I think what we're trying to do is bring this distant history much more up close.
So we've got lots of strategies that we can do. If we're absent photographs and newsreels, we don't have to hang our head in shame and despair. We can emphasize paintings, we can emphasize the lithographs, we can emphasize drawings. We can shoot timeless, modern, live cinematography of the topography of the land. One of the great forces in this story is weather and the size of the land. I mean, if Britain had understood that going in, they probably wouldn't have tried to resist. And it's the undoing of a lot of their plans. We have one episode, the fifth, called The Soul of All America. The Britons think that if you capture Philadelphia or Paris or London, or you've caught the country, because that was true there, but it's not true. You just move to York, Pennsylvania and keep going, or Baltimore, or whatever it is. And so Thomas Paine, every single one of our episodes is after Thomas Paine, who's the most lower D democratic writer of the time. He speaks to ordinary people, and he has this, and a violent foe of monarchy. So each of the episodes is after a phrase of his. And we've filmed reenactors, not sort of recreating battles or seeing their faces, but in a kind of impressionistic way, which is incredibly dramatic and helps satisfy that. And then, as Sarah's alluding to, if you're telling more than just the stories of the familiar people, or when you deal with those familiar people, you've seen them from lots of different perspectives, it really helps that something that I started, which was using first-person voices in addition to a third-person narrator, to help bring it alive. And we have literally hundreds of voices, and they are read by some people you may have heard of, like Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks and Samuel L. Jackson and LaTanya Richardson and Morgan Freeman and Hugh Dancy and Damian Lewis and Sir Kenneth Branagh and Claire Danes and Laura Linney and Paul Giamatti. And I mean, I've probably gone through
It's ridiculous.
a fifth of the list. A fifth of the list. And to hear them, and it's wonderful, they're in some ways often the first guard, first line. When they hear it, they go, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And it's, when they get into it and they invest it with meaning, you begin. Maya Hawke is a young girl named Betsy Ambler who happens to be born in Yorktown. We have a kid named John Greenwood from Boston, Massachusetts, who joins the Patriot Army at 14 and serves all the way through. And we're not going to tell you what happens to him. It's unbelievable. We follow ordinary soldiers. We follow a loyalist. We forget that at least 20%, if not more, our Civil War is a sectional war. Our revolution is a civil war. And there's not a family that doesn't have people. Henry Knox from Boston and his wife Lucy, he's the guy who goes to Ticonderoga and brings back the cannon that drive the British out of Boston finally, after Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. She loses, as she points it, her entire family. Her father, her mother, her sister, her brother, her aunt, her uncle, because she and her husband have chosen the patriot cause, and they have chosen the loyalist. And what is the loyalist cause? It's keeping things as they are, saying we're Englishmen and women. How is this different? And so we follow one man named John Peters all throughout the war as a loyalist who ends up in a battle he's losing, Bennington. He's not a major general, but he's in charge of a regiment of loyalists that he's assembled in Canada after being banished from his Vermont, not a state, but a contested region. He is obliged to kill one of his close childhood friends in the battle as the friend is stabbing him and the bayonet hits his rib cage. He is discharging his pistol, and that's the American Revolution that people don't understand. And because it's a symphony with three movements, New England, Mid-Atlantics, and South, there's lots of times when the other areas seem dormant and you think nothing's going on. There's not. This is a world war involving another world war. The French and Indian War was called the 7 Years' War. It's a world war involving dozens of nations, European as well as Native American. And so when there are militias dormant in the South, they are expanding the territorial boundaries of the 13 colonies, now states. It's super complicated and much more interesting, and it's not hinged on what we do everywhere else is a dialectic, right? It's not a binary thing. It's just complicated and therefore super interesting. And good stories are the delivery vehicles to help people understand, to change minds, to make a powerful statement about things. And we'd rather tell stories than argue.
That's so true. I want to come back to the filmmaking technique a little bit later in this tool called the Ken-Burns effect. Have you heard of it? Yeah.
I've got a good story about that.
But yeah, I am curious because I think one of the more compelling elements of your filmmaking is the stories of a variety of different individuals. We're not hearing necessarily from kings and generals only and just hearing speeches and lectures and things like that, but individual like citizens in all of capacities. I'm sort of curious why that's so important to you in the filmmaking and how that helps us relate to historical fact.
Well, I think it marries the top down and the bottom up, and that is in all the work that we do and all the films that we make, particularly in stories of war. I think that's extremely important that you hear what the leaders are thinking and how they're understanding it, and then what is the impact on the ground in actual families. So I don't think we would make a film without those two perspectives braided together. And I think it's an effective tool to bring audiences in because, as Ken always says, history with dry dates and facts is like, eat your broccoli and your eggplant, whereas you tell a great story, everybody's really curious. That general said everyone should go there, and John Greenwood is here, and what is going to happen? And it's that's why we get up and do the work that we do.
I think that's exactly right. And I think within the dynamics of the so-called top-down or in the dynamics of the bottom-up, you also have to extend to them dimension and range. So when we think of Abigail Adams, we think of remember the ladies, period. Like it's just cute. Like at least someone was thinking of it. And what was the phrase? Ladies, right? But her letter to her husband in Philadelphia is devastating. She's saying, basically, you men, you husbands, have effed this up forever. And if you don't get your S together, this race of Amazons is going to come and show you how to do it. So that sort of makes...
She's a big hero.
That sort of makes Remember the Ladies sort of, this is the tip of the iceberg, right? And the men are the Titanic, right? And it's got new resonances when you hear it. Or one we follow among the ordinary grunts, a patriot grunt is a guy named Joseph Plum Martin, and he's everywhere, right? And sometimes he goes home, he's just exhausted, and he gets bored and he comes back. Other people get sick and they get wounded, they come back to this cause. For what reason? These are not self-evident truths, right? We hold these truths. What is true about, for the first time in human history, having people be not subjects but citizens? There's nothing self-evident. In our Benjamin Franklin film of a few years ago, somebody said, it's the old lawyer's dodge. Chris Brown, right? He says, just tell them it's self-evident, and maybe you can make it so, right? If you say it long enough, it will become. There's nothing self-evident about the rest of that sentence, including the obvious. contradictions and hypocrisies of the person who's writing it, who believes that all men are created equal, but owns hundreds of human beings in his lifetime. That does not disqualify him in any way. He distilled a century of Enlightenment thinking into this one sentence that is, next to I love you, I don't know a better sentence in the English language. And that's an important thing to remember.
And there's enormous flexibility in our founding documents that create the history that we all get to study every day.
So the 250th anniversary of our country is coming up in 2026, something like that.
Oh my God, it's soon.
Convenient timing for your documentary. Yeah. So
this happens, you know, when we should make a movie. When I started work, I looked like I was 12 years old on my first film on Brooklyn Bridge that ended up on PBS, and somebody kindly said 40 years. It's been 50. It took so long to do it, to raise the money, that all of a sudden they said, oh, you're so smart. You had this come out at the time of the centennial of the Brooklyn Bridge. Or you worked for so long on another, oh, it's the centennial of the Statue of Liberty. And you're going, no. And so this one is the same way. There was nothing in our decision to do this that in any way was trying to hit some sort of deadline or marker. We suddenly, a few years ago, realized, oh my goodness. The good thing is, and I may be anticipating your question, and if I'm not, forgive me for taking it off track. On July 4th, 2026, will be the semi-quincentennial of the United States of America, based on the signing of the Declaration. The war, the American Revolution, the title of our film, began in April of 1775, which makes this coming year the 250th. And we are so concerned that our nation not be drowned in superficial fife and drum treacle about this, that we have a complicated and sophisticated story to tell, that we could come out first and help sort of lead a national conversation about that complexity, to celebrate the fact that there is not a person in this country that will not have purchase, that will not have a stake in the story we're telling, even if you just crossed the Rio Grande yesterday, or if you came on the Mayflower, or the year before in 1619, or you are a Native American that's been here for 22,000 years.
So yes, it does lead into my next question, which is about,
Sorry.
you're so good. Obviously there's many museums and historical organizations are going to be involved in this, and I'm sort of curious, what are some resources or other organizations that you worked with to produce the film?
Well, we work by ourselves in producing the film, but we have availed ourselves of the enormously generous help of obviously scholars and institutions, but also for this film, we've worked really closely with Colonial Williamsburg, with Mount Vernon, with Monticello, with the Smithsonian, with the Library of Congress, with our National Archives, all of the big organizations that help keep our history and are always very generous to us. And I think, Paula Kerger, the head of PBS, said it so beautifully to us a few years ago. We want to make sure that we're amplifying what everybody else is doing. There's room for all of us, the National Constitution Center, the work that iCivics does. And we want the tool of a 12-hour film is really useful and a great way to bring in all those institutions to be both part of what we're doing, but also for us to amplify what they are doing.
We see these partners as we're finishing. And normally about this time, a year out from broadcast, we'd begin thinking about educational outreach. We've been doing it for 3.5, 4 years. And that's a really central part. And Sarah can talk a little bit about the dynamics of that. But we've identified, too, in the last several years, lots of force multipliers. Our corporate underwriter is Bank of America, which has second largest bank in the country and has all these branches and all these ATMs and places where the word can come out. Colonial Williamsburg is sort of the convener of more than 300 historical organizations. Whether you've got a story or a leg in the American Revolution doesn't matter. This is our story. You could be in Fairbanks, Alaska, or Honolulu. This is our story. That's really, really important to us. We have the United States military who fought this war, was created during this war, that has a stake in the complex lessons to be learned. And the military are the first to be the ones who face complicated stories with a kind of directness and honesty you wouldn't necessarily think they would have. PBS is the largest network in this country with 335 stations, and you are important partners to us because you reach into classrooms in every state in the union, and every one of your students are people we want to reach with this complex story. And we promise that there is, as I said, something in there, in this story, for everyone. Not just, oh, we're mentioning my state, or we're subscribed, these people represent views that represent my political views now, but that they are people engaged in a story that is as complex as I believe my ancestors experienced. And that's a thing. So we're really dependent on you helping to spread the word, since we're here, to every Middlesex village and farm.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, there was a report that just came out by the American Historical Association about the state of U.S. history education. And one of the findings was that increasingly teachers are relying on online sources and curating their own resources increasingly over textbooks. And so I'm sort of curious, I know many of your films are included in excerpts on the PBS Learning Media website, along with lesson plans and other resources. And so I'm sort of curious, what do you see as your role of your documentaries in the classroom?
Really good question.
Well, I think one of the reasons we love to make films at public television is because we get to have the film live on in classrooms for years after the films air. And I think it's central to what we do. And we have, over the course of my working with Ken, begun to do the educational materials, not after the film, as Ken was just saying, but while we're making the film, we're thinking about and working with teachers and organizations about not just the process of making the film, but what lesson plans and what themes and what age groups and how can we do better and how can we expand and what other organizations are doing that work and how can we work with them and give them this asset, which teachers do seem to really love to work with. So it is absolutely central to what we do. I think for a film like this, and because it's America's birthday, we get the opportunity to work with every age group, which we don't often do. We are usually middle and high school and occasionally college, and we do a lot with what we say is sort of, civic engagement and adult learning through UNAM and other things like that. But, every elementary school student will have some relationship to this birthday. So we really are thinking about little kids, middle school kids, high school kids, and how to unite our college students around this topic.
Can you give us a highlight or a sneak peek of what are some of those resources that are going to be available for PBS Learning Media?
Yeah, we will have, I know there are going to be, 10 specific lesson plans, again, for each age group, and we will think about the big questions like strengths and failures of democracy. What does liberty mean? Are you in the North? Are you in the South? How is the war different? I think it is a huge geographical space that, as Ken was alluding to earlier, England's like a little country, and first of all, it takes many, many, many weeks for information to go back and forth. And so for students today to try to understand the mechanisms of a war in the 18th century, and they're used to Twitter, right? They can't even imagine that it takes sometimes 2 months for information to go from one place to another. And then if you live in Boston, your world is completely different than if you live in Virginia, than if you live in South Carolina. And so there's geography, there's weather, as Ken was saying earlier, there's a global war. What was the role of France? What was the role of Spain? Could we have won without them? What is that like? Why don't we think about the American Revolution that way? Was it likely we were going to win? No. So I think there's something in there for everybody and every age group.
So, one good example is the 13 colonies that created the United States were the least profitable colonies of 25, 26 that Britain had in North America. The least profitable. The most profitable of the colonies were South Carolina and Virginia. They had the most number of slaves. Jamaica, with 90% slaves, is the most profitable, right? The least profitable is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which has the fewest dependents on slaves, but very
Without
big.
them, we couldn't have won.
Very big into smuggling. Very, very big into smuggling. Lots of the impositions of Parliament, crimps the smuggler's style. The richest man in Boston is John Hancock, and he's a smuggler. So you've got a complex dynamic, and those are the kinds of things you can engage with people. And telling stories is a really important way than just doing it as a kind of essayistic binary, arguments. Arguments are important within stories, but they don't carry things the way stories do.
I'm really curious about that. And the storytelling piece of this, your storytellers. And my students create multimedia research projects and documentary films and things like that. And I've really seen how it really transforms their understanding of the material when they have to wrestle with it, when it's student-centered and engaging and experiential. And I'm sort of curious how you both have been maybe transformed by the act of creating these stories, like personally and also in your relationship to history.
Utterly and completely. And I mean, I see in National History Day as such a wonderful thing that I participate in, and we judge and we give scholarships to winners, and they're wonderful 10-minute films. They're really great. They're kind of essays, visual essays, and they begin to understand the layers of complexity that can be added to an argument. Our Civil War series begins with a guy named Wilmer McLean, right, who's the first battle of the Civil War rages across the aging Virginians' farmland, a Union shell going into exploding in the summer kitchen. And he decides to move his family out of harm's way far south and west of Richmond to a tiny crossroads called Appomattox Courthouse. And it was there that Lee surrendered to Grant, and Wilmer McLean could rightfully say, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." We just want to tell, we had always read, my brother Rick and I had always read this in the last chapter of every book. So when you got to Appomattox, you then learned the side note, footnote, star Wilmer McLean. But if you put it up front, you've just said an intimate thing. And so we are all about telling stories that go beyond, as I was saying before, and I don't mean to be redundant, beyond the argument and beyond the binary. There's nothing that's actually binary in nature, and we are always certain there's an us and a them. So we're very much about the us. Capitalize the US, lowercase the intimacy of us, which has no them. There's no them. There's no them.
I think, just add on, beautiful answer. It's very hard to follow, Ken, but I'll try. I think for me, one of the ways that the work that we do together and the way that we can think about history has changed me, and I hope translates into classrooms, is to have kids and students be excited to understand imagery. We're not writing books and essays, we're making films. So we're bringing you in to a visual medium, whether it's a photograph or, this film is also a celebration of our vast landscape and the sacred places where this war took place and how to look at them and understand them 250 years later. But I think it's the most rewarding and the most exciting when audiences think about Washington crossing the Delaware and realize, oh, that's could not have happened, and why? Or who took that photograph? How should I think about that photograph? I've been told to think about that image this way, but actually if I spend 5 minutes thinking about it, there's a lot more going on. And so I think while we were making the Vietnam film, that sort of key phrase of media literacy came across our desks, but I do think having our citizenry engaged in a kind of dynamic and fun and rewarding conversation around imagery is part of what we do.
So important. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah. Okay, so I'm stunned by your level of detail and facts and mastery of all this content. I'm sort of curious because documentaries rely heavily on research. And I'm sort of curious, Sarah, like the process around the extensive research you guys did. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Was it mostly done before you started working on the film, or does it happen throughout the entire process, or what does that look like?
We're almost done. We're going to lock this, I promise, at the end of January, all 6 episodes. We will still be researching after it's locked. Vietnam, which was locked in December of 2015 in anticipation of a 2017, we unlocked hundreds of times in order to find out new information. This is the problem. If you just research for 3 weeks or 3 months, write for 3 weeks or 3 months, film the script, meaning I interview you, Mike, can you get me, Michael, from paragraph 2 to paragraph 3 on page 17 of episode 2. Thank you. Could you say that a little bit shorter? We've never done that. Every time you see a talking head in our film, it's a happy accident. I mean, obviously, somebody's not going to be talking about Bunker Hill if we're not in the Battle of Bunker Hill, but you know what I mean? We have not written that in. We are constantly rewriting and writing, and that first draft never, I mean, by the time we're done, it's draft 16 or 17, and it means that we so rearranged that earlier thing or rewrote or changed the nuance or found a new character to put in. I mean, we've been working on this for 8 years, and the Loyalist that I told you about, John Peters, got added in after April. We just found a new quote. Sarah found a new quote from George Washington that was just perfect in a place. So we are literally, and we're always fact-checking, always fact-checking.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ken just said it beautifully. Our process is enormously fluid, and people are, I think, very surprised when they come into our editing room how much we do really obsess about every word choice, every comma, every movement on every image. But also, when we sit down and decide we're going to do the American Revolution 10 years before the film comes out, we try to understand the landscape of who's working in that topic, those that seem fairly obvious, those who are unusual, you wouldn't necessarily think would be in a film about the American Revolution, and they help us the entire time, and they're often surprised by, you're going to read a first draft of a script, half of the interviews have been done before we even had a script, then we're constantly thinking about other people to talk to, and we're just building on story and fact and history and how those things, the interpretation of those facts weave together, and we literally never stop till we hand the tape to PBS.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. It's not just finding a new quote from Washington or adding the Loyalist guy, but we've put in a scene just this fall on deism.
Right.
Which is just, you know, and it begins with this wonderful and provocative quote from Thomas Jefferson that says, you know, if my neighbor believes in 20 gods or no God at all, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Now, most of the history of the world, as we've discussed, is war, and most of the history of those wars have to do with religious differences. And so that changes the dynamic automatically.
Right, and that scene is paired beautifully with a quote about how important education was to our founders, and that they believed if you did not have an educated populace, you could not have a great country, and that, I think, is something we need to remember.
This is the key to this whole project.
Yes.
Not our project, but the American project.
100%.
The pursuit of happiness is not the acquisition of objects in a marketplace of things. It is lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. If you are not virtuous, meaning you have spent your life dedicated to improving your condition and the condition of those around you, you cannot be an educated citizenry. You are back to being subjects. And our job, your job, is to be on the front line of that. That's our job. That's what the pursuit of happiness means. There's no argument. This is not an interpretive thing. That's what they meant, every single one of them. Pursuit of happiness. They didn't follow Locke and say property. It's, of course, a big thing about property, and one of the essential dynamics is what is the difference between your relationship to the land among the hundreds of native nations engaged in this continent and what the English sense of property came. And so that's another theme that we can deal with, but we're not unclear about what the pursuit of happiness means. This is what it means. Lifelong learning.
This is why we mic drop. Incredible. Okay, so I want to get back to the storytelling piece because I'm really fascinated by that. You mentioned earlier, and people don't realize if they haven't made a film before, especially a 12-hour film, that filmmaking is all about the visuals. And so if there is no photography, if there is no video or film, what do you do for 12 hours? What do you show? And so I'm sort of curious, like I talk to my students about, my journalism students or my filmmaking students making documentaries, this is called visual evidence. Can you go out and record an action or the interview or something like that? So how do you create or find visual evidence and also do it in a way that's compelling as far as storytelling?
I'll start, and then he'll remind you what I didn't think about. Well, I think we are, we are always using the elements of the films that Ken is so famous for: live cinematography, the interviews, photographs or paintings, lithographs. For this film, the other element, and we'll talk a little bit about the live cinematography. I think we'll probably both talk about that, because how we got better as we went and got more experimental and sort of began to think about how to visualize things differently. But we also built an 18th century model of the world so that we could have maps. The maps from the time and the documents of the time and the pamphlets of the time are the documentary evidence, right? Those are the things that existed then, and it's very interesting to study them. The maps are often very political. They're also very beautiful. There were French maps, German maps, British maps, American maps, native maps. So maps are hugely central here. But then we built, over the course of 5 years, with someone who is a cartographer and a specialist in 18th century America, what the 13 colonies, the 26...
We're underwater right now, by the way.
North America, look like, so that we can show sort of some sense of the geography. So the maps are, I don't think when we started we would have quite appreciated how important the maps are, and hopefully that will actually be a great tool for teachers and students to look at the world today, look at the world then, try to understand how everything worked and what things looked like. Trees were much bigger, rivers were in different places, there were no roads in the ways that we understand them. People got places by water. I mean, just totally. The armies traveled with, horses and cattle and animals, and women and children went with the armies, and just moving the war to Virginia, and the march to Yorktown will be, I think, extremely fun. And that all of those things are hard to visualize, and we got to film over 6 years in every season in every part of the country, with people who do reenactments for a living. Although you don't see them, they're very abstract, and Ken will talk about sort of how he thought about using the reenactments. But then we also filmed through glass, we filmed through flame, we filmed very, very high up, not just your typical drone stuff. But at one point they said to us, you can't fly the drone except if you're very high. And I remember saying, well, God's really high up maybe, so let's see what that would look like. And it actually really works. You sort of see a landscape and you can try to imagine what it's like to look down on a war that's happening below. So we're still experimenting with stuff even right now and trying new things.
Yeah, I think the trick before was to treat the live cinematography as if it was a painting, and to treat the photographs and the paintings as if they were real, so that you would move in them and tell the stories and pick them apart. And with photographs, you can do that for 20 hours. We've done it for 20 hours. With paintings, you go about 4 or 5 paintings, and you're now in a sense of, not cartoony, but you realize the extent to which it's not real. You begin to fall out of the dimensional thing you're trying to create, and you get to the plasticity or the two-dimensionality of the painting, and you realize this is just a representation. Whereas a photograph seems to be a frozen moment, and we can assume and try to assume that it had a past and a future, so that you can ask questions of it visually to tell a story. You can tilt up from the waistband of a Confederate kid. You don't know it's a kid, there's just 2 pistols in a waistband, and you get up and you've got this cherubic face of a 14-year-old, or tilt down, cherubic face of a 14-year-old to a waistband filled with pistols, right? that's a story just right in and of itself. And we can do that with paintings, but after a while, we have lots of drawings and lithographs. We found a company that had done some watercolors of the Revolution, and we actually commissioned them to tell us the places where we felt that all we had were kind of garish modern paintings, illustrations, and I know the teachers here know in their textbooks some of the battle stuff the modern stuff doesn't have the same feeling as even the heroic standing in the boat crossing the Delaware does. So it's all trying to figure out the dynamics of that. I take a walk I live in rural New Hampshire, and I take a walk of 3 miles every morning, and I just took my phone along, and there are maybe 100 shots that I took at dawn of places that are not too different to give a sense, and it's one of the elements that we use to just sort of take away from, I mean, in episode 6, every once in a while we begin to put a photograph in because we're ranging ahead to what that person's fate is. And it's very interesting to see what happens when you've got something that's supposedly real. The only thing I'll add to that is that we're not just looking at these things, we're listening to them, right? Are the troops tramping? You know, are the cannon firing? Are the leaves rustling? So what we're doing is trying to wake up whatever that thing is and give you a sense that you're participating in that moment, you know, that it may not turn out the way you think it is going to is the great gift. When we said at the beginning of the Civil War, Lee surrendered to Grant, that is the last time you hear that until the end of episode 8, when he does surrender in Wilmer McLean's front parlor. So you don't know, and you go to Ford's Theater in the beginning of the next episode thinking, and this is the best part of history, maybe the gun will jam. And if you do your job right, that's what you hope.
I thought Ken was going to say the one element that we haven't talked about that I think does the same thing, and even more so than the sound design, and thinking it might not turn out that way. There's a great story about that. Is the music of the time. And so how do you, I mean, for the way I thought about it anyway, was sort of the Yo-Yo Ma on the Silk Road. I wanted to understand, what did it sound like in North America? There's classical music, there's native music, there's black music, there's music in the North, music in the South. Everybody's listening. Music brings us together and is kind of a mishmash of sound, and so we have all of that in the series, and I hope that people will talk about the music of the time. But then we were really, really, really blessed that Rhiannon Giddens, Yo-Yo Ma, an unbelievable Tuscaroran woman named Jennifer Kreisberg all came in, and then we did probably 2 weeks of drumming, because drum is so important to a war, but also very important to the 18th century and to every culture. So the music, I think, is another element that hopefully students will also love to try to understand why we chose to play the music that we are playing in the series.
I didn't know Rhiannon Giddens was in there. I'm a big fan of her
amazing.
work. Yeah,
You will, this will blow your mind, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I heard that story, that rumor that you shot several shots with your iPhone. And it's sort of interesting, like maybe gives us courage as high school teachers or middle school teachers that our students can produce documentaries as well with the tools we have in our pockets. We don't need a huge budget and crew to do that. So that's really great.
It's very fun to see how Ken sees. One of our senior editors and I always, why did he frame it exactly that way? And then he's always right.
So I walked out of my house before dawn, and the sun was coming up. There's sort of a very steep hill of mostly coniferous trees, and the sun was beginning to poke through. And as I had my dog on the leash in one hand, and I started walking around it, and the shots in the film, and you know there's a battle happening over there. Like, you can see the way it's just, there's got to be through these trees. If you added the soundtrack of Battle, you would be absolutely sure that I had filmed Battle, you know, in late July of 2023, you know, when I came out to walk my dog in the morning, you know?
Definitely sound is half of a film, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. So you guys worked on this for quite a while, and I'm sort of curious, what surprised you the most through this project?
No, you can go.
I mean, everything. I think, all joking aside, I think it is actually shocking when you begin to think about our origin story and our revolution, how little we know, how little we're taught, how little we understand, the myths that we've told ourselves over and over and over again, who's left out, the emphasis is sort of, it is deeply, deeply interesting and complicated and worth celebrating and worth criticizing. And I mean, we just really can't wait to have everybody hopefully come together to talk about it. It's endlessly interesting.
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. We don't make films about subjects we know about and then tell you what you should know. We're interested in sharing with people the process of discovery, and that's a little bit more exciting. Listen to what we just found out. And so it comes in a blizzard, a tsunami of facts all the time, little tiny things, some of which we've, peppered our conversation this morning with. But it's really, it is this origin story where we are a country that actually knows where and precisely when, down to the day, that we were formed and for what reason, which is a phenomenal gift, which we have in many ways squandered. No, it's nobody's to blame. It's just lawful that this stuff, the farther away from the lake you get, the bigger the fish gets, right? And we've tried to go back and figure out just precisely how large this thing is. And I will tell you, this is as big as anything we've touched. I was out on the road 2 years ago for the film that Sarah and I made called The U.S. and the Holocaust. And somebody said, in world history, is the Holocaust the most important event since the birth of Christ? And I said, no. It's the start of the United States of America. That's the biggest thing. And I just started to cry. And I mean that sincerely. Nobody'd ever done this before. The Holocaust is hugely important, and it is more than a humanitarian crisis. It is the nadir of human behavior and human civilization. But this still is about potentiality and possibility. And that is a really, really good story. And so we don't ruin this by telling you we end on a quote by Benjamin Rush, that the war is over, but the revolution is still going on. And it's about how you live up to this completely radical and not self-evident idea that human beings can govern themselves and that the enemy of that progress is despotism and monarchy and fascism and things like that.
I don't think I have any more questions for you. I think that pretty much sums it
Can't
up.
follow that.
Is there anything else you guys would like to add about your film?
No, we're just really excited to work with you and hope we have a chance to do that.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, so we are hugely indebted to all the teachers in the country, and
Yeah.
we really do get up in the morning to make films that hopefully are useful to all of you.
Yeah, true. You guys got the tough jobs.
Just once more, I want to reiterate the resources that are available through PBS Learning Media. There should be a QR code on the card that you guys have on your seat and maybe on the screen as well. So thank you again so much, you guys. Really appreciate it.
Michael.
Thank you, Ken, Sarah, and Michael, for bringing our time here to an amazing end.